So I do have a presentation that I'm going to pull up while I'm talking here. We'll see how the multitasking goes. That gives a little bit of sort of high level overview of the kinds of things that affordable housing strategies typically deal with or think about, as well as some of the sort of theoretical framework for it. But I promise I won't go into too much detail and I won't go on for too long because we have quite a few questions that we'd like to talk with you all about. So I see this as being very much a sort of discussion-oriented process. Please jump in if you have questions. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. Because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see you all. So if you're trying to raise your hand, I don't think I can see that. So just feel free to jump in and let me know if you have something that you want to dig in a little bit more deeply on. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview presentation, and then Oscar's going to run us through the scope of work, what we see as being the process that we'll be going through on affordable housing. And then we have some discussion questions to go forward with. So as a starting place, I'm going to give a little overview of what we think the strategy might look like, the kinds of things that typically are included in affordable housing strategies as our first step on the agenda. So I really just want to put a few starting place thoughts out there. This is literally our first conversation about the meat of this. So I'm intentionally leaving this pretty generic and trying to give just some sort of starting place thoughts about what we have run into in the many housing strategies that we have done, and some of the lessons that we've learned in that process. So first of all, the local situation absolutely needs to drive the content and the focus of housing strategies. We have worked on strategies that have been focused on constructing housing that is affordable or even market rate housing. We have worked on affordable housing strategies that are focused on programs and services to help to provide access to housing for people who need it, and to provide the sort of wraparound services that are necessary to allow people to be successful as they enter into housing, and those that have focused on both of those topics. So we'll want your feedback when we get into the discussion part about where you see the biggest need being. Housing strategies can address the full spectrum of housing needs. I'm currently in Portland, Oregon, and I do a lot of work in Oregon. And in Oregon, we have to look at the entire spectrum of housing needs over 20 years for affordability at all price points. So sometimes that's the approach that can be taken, but sometimes they more explicitly focus only on affordability, and we'll want your feedback and thoughts about where to focus on that spectrum. And then they always need to think about how you can leverage partnerships and the public sector controlled tools. And those are very unique to the local environment. So another thing that we'd like to talk with you about are who are the players that are in your housing ecosystem that we need to make sure that we're engaging and that we need to think about as being able to bring resources to the table. Housing is a very complicated, sort of networked, systems related problem that involves market variables as well as all kinds of sort of other nonprofits and housing affordability focused housing authorities that all need to be working together in order to make a meaningful difference. So understanding who those players are and which parts of the tools they control is critical. But then also you as a representative of public sector control some pretty fundamental and pretty important tools. And so we'll want to make sure that we're paying attention to those and how those are different for the county versus for the city, for example. And then last but not least, regardless of where it is and how you're focusing, we do have to acknowledge that the vast majority of housing is provided by the private market. And the sort of fundamentals of how the housing market functions have to be part of what housing strategies focus on and really understand. So I'm going to actually spend a little bit of time just at a very high level talking about some of those fundamentals of housing economics just to kind of get us grounded, and then we can go from there. So first of all, we think of housing on a continuum, and what we're representing here in this graphic is that we need housing that meets the needs of everybody from extremely low income, 0 to 30% of median family or area median income, all the way on up to luxury housing, because we do have needs at each and every one of these price points. The housing market is going to do a pretty good job in most cases of meeting the needs at the upper end of the income spectrum. It's very common and expected that new construction, when it comes online, is at these higher price points simply because it's expensive and difficult to build new housing. And so without any kind of support, it's going to show up at this upper end. At the same time, the market is almost never going to be providing housing that is affordable to people below roughly 60% of median family income, and sometimes even higher than that, depending on that particular market. So we're calling that the supported environment, because without public sector intervention, these kinds of units are just simply not going to be built. In the middle part of the spectrum here is this sort of fuzzy green box area where you have your workforce housing and housing that's more affordable for those of moderate income. If you have a situation in your market where there's a sufficient amount of new housing supply coming online to match demand, so if your population isn't growing faster than your housing market, the total supply in your housing market is, oftentimes the market can meet a lot of this need, especially over time, because new construction comes in at the upper end. Over time, it depreciates and becomes more affordable to these folks. But if you're out of whack, if you're underproducing housing relative to demand, this green box can be a place where there's a tremendous amount of unmet need. And in many of the communities that are experiencing fast, rapid growth, like I know you all are, this becomes a really important area of focus for a housing strategy. So I wanted to just quickly introduce that concept so that when I say things like market environment and supported environment, you know what I mean and understand that there's this overlap area in the middle. Okay, so the other thing is, regardless of kind of where we focus between construction versus programs and services, thinking about how new development occurs is really critical to understanding how to influence housing production, both for affordable units that might be rent restricted and public supported in that supported environment, and for market rate units. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the fundamentals of the economics of development, thinking about it from the developer's perspective. So if you're a developer and you're trying to get housing to occur, you really kind of have to have the magic stars, the magic Venn diagram bubbles here overlap. You have to have supportive public policy that allows the kind of unit that you'd like to see on the ground actually be built. It has to be that kind of density and that kind of setbacks, all of that matters. You have to have control of the land. That's obviously very critical. You have to have access to capital to be able to invest in your development. And you have to have market feasibility, which is pretty simply thought about as the fact that the cost of construction has to be more than covered by the revenues, whether in rent or sales prices, that come off of that construction. And the differential, that growth, has to be sufficient to be able to cover the cost of your capital. So all of this has to align, and you're going to be thinking about all parts of it. I want to dig a little bit more into the operating revenues piece. So going back to this, the market feasibility piece, mostly just to get some vocabulary out there so that when I'm saying things, we all kind of know what I'm talking about, but also because it matters quite a lot to thinking about what the public sector levers are that can influence production. So the basic equation, simple, intuitive: revenues have to exceed costs and expenses. There have to be some returns. In this example, we're looking at an apartment complex. So the revenues can be broken down into rent. Maybe there's a retail component. Maybe you're lucky enough to be able to get some revenue off of parking. That bar has to be longer than your cost and expenses bar. So we have to be able to have enough rent coming in to cover debt service. So this is where you're paying for the cost of construction. But you also have to think about operations. You are going to have some vacancy, you've got to keep some reserves, and there's property taxes. So all of these operating expenses have to be less than revenues. And if you're lucky, you have this lovely little gray box over here that gives you some net cash flow, which you can use to then pay off the cost of your equity and to kind of keep this thing flowing and maybe get some returns to yourself as a developer as well. So the reason to go through that in so much detail is that when you start to think about the levers that you all control as the public sector, it lines up very nicely with the development timeline and is influenced by the thinking about the way the operations function. So development timeline, this looks very linear. If any of you have development experience, you know that it is not this linear. There's a lot of circularity and back and forth that can occur, but for the sake of argument, start with getting site selection, move into permitting, figure out how you're going to pay for it, build the thing, and then operate it over time. And in each of those segments of time, there are ways that the public sector intersects with the process and can influence the kind of outcome that is achieved from development perspective. So when I say influence, what I mean is if you're trying to encourage affordable housing, you can tie some of these public sector levers specifically to the outcome of affordability. Or if what you're trying to do is just see any development happen, which sometimes is the case if you're underproducing, then you can think about ways that you can influence just overall construction. So on the site selection and land control, we have, if you own land as public sector, you get to control its destiny. So land control is very important, and thinking about the possibility of actually acquiring land. And then from there, these are your typical sort of planning roles. And I'm glad to see that we've got at least a couple of planners here, because if there are specific questions that come up, they may be able to answer them better than I can at this point. But things like zoning, your long-term growth management, and thinking about land supply, those things are all very critical to allowing a developer to be able to select a site and control the land. Moving into project design and permitting, the public sector controls the built form. So what can be built on a site, and even what does it look like in some cases, depending upon the way your code is set up. You control the permitting timeline and fees, as well as impact fees. Sometimes there are issues of design costs or impact reviews, depending on where the building is constructed and what the zoning code requires. But all of these things can affect the project design and permitting timeline. On the financing side, public sector can do some things that can really help to change the fundamentals of the feasibility equation for developers. Grants are a really great way to be able to do that. And loans are a possibility. It is challenging to be able to provide a loan at a lower interest rate than a developer can get on the market in the current interest rate environment. But back in the old days of not that long ago, low interest or no interest loans were really, really useful tools that could help to influence development outcomes. And then when you get into construction, the big issues are really around infrastructure cost and how those are being paid for. Is it something that is paid for through impact fees by the development, or is it something that's paid for by the public sector? And then when you get into the building actually operating after it's been constructed and has tenants in it, this is where a lot of the sort of programmatic pieces come in and can be really critical. So rent subsidies or vouchers to help to get people into units, tenant protections to make sure that there's not discrimination going on. Those kinds of programs are often very, very critical components of affordable housing strategies. But there are other ways that the public sector also interfaces with operations. For example, tax abatements are commonly used tools to help to encourage and incent affordable unit rent. And there can also be changes in the way that reporting requirements are advanced. I did want to just at least throw out a plug there that the financial picture for rent-restricted affordable housing is different. So supported affordable housing. That basic equation that I showed you is, of course, the same. Once the building is up and running, you still have to be able to have enough rent to overcome the cost of operating the building, but the construction phase can look really different. So when you're in the open market, you have to have your capital, you've got equity investors, you might have some gap financing, and then you've got your long-term debt. It's relatively straightforward. And most market rate buildings are going to look something kind of like this. When you're in the affordable housing world, you still have those same three sort of foundational pieces, but grants and tax credits are completely critical to making affordable housing work. And a lot of affordable housing strategies will focus on making sure that there's sufficient grant and other types of incentives available to make affordable housing function. So low-income housing tax credits are a key source of funding for many types of developments. However, we've also seen a lot of local governments who are creating their own revenue sources specifically to help to encourage and incent affordable housing production, and are putting out bonds or other kinds of even general fund dollars to help to support those developments. So long story short, most affordable housing strategies in some way acknowledge that in the market environment, the housing market is going to do most of the work for you. And what you're mostly trying to do in that environment is make sure that you've got a supportive regulatory environment where you've got zoning and land supply that is supportive of new development. You've been thoughtful about infrastructure. Your impact fees are not creating impediments to development occurring, and that the review process works well. In the supported environment, that's where you're really looking to use your resources to ensure that there's affordability and to figure out from a programmatic perspective how you get the people who most need housing into the units that are available. So that's where you spend your dollars and target your incentives. If you have land or are going to acquire land, that's where that typically comes in. And that's usually where programs and tenant supports function as well. Just a quick note that just as a reminder, there's often a sort of fuzzy area between what's market and what's supported. It's not a clean delineation there. And oftentimes incentives are used for that sort of middle green box, if you remember that graphic that I showed earlier, to try to encourage, and funding is used for the very low income piece to make sure that the dollars are really going where they're most needed. But that's something that as we get into doing, especially the sort of foundational work of understanding your housing market, we'll really want to understand as much as we can the size and shape of that green box. So I'm going to pause for just a minute and see if there are any questions about that. Very quick high-level flyover to just kind of get us grounded in some of the fundamentals of what affordability strategies can look like.
Is anybody doing the hand raise or any questions?
No,
I hope I didn't just overwhelm. Hopefully I just didn't overwhelm everybody.
No, Lorelai, I've got one for you. This is Josh. I'm just looking at this slide right here for the market environment to create a supportive regulatory environment. Are you saying this is just kind of the standard set of this is the area within which a local government would want to work if they were concerned about creating more affordable housing within that's left to the market?
So we have to get careful about our terms here because affordable housing that is affordable to someone at a middle or upper income is totally critical to have being constructed. And you all need to do less to make that happen than you do for housing that is affordable to people at the lowest end of the income spectrum. So what this is saying is that, and all development is important, right? Because what happens if you don't have enough supply, new housing supply come on to match the population growth and the demand is that prices rise.
Yeah.
So you do need to have, go ahead.
I just wonder if this is also supposed to mean a description of the elements that contribute to the cost of a house. Yeah. And I just don't see demand in here. And this isn't something we really can control, but if demand is super high, prices are going to be high, regardless of the degree of forgivingness within the world of zoning and planning, et cetera, or restrictiveness. I kind of wonder if you could talk for just a second on to what degree did the elements of creating housing contribute to the cost of that house? So is demand a greater contributor than how difficult zoning and permitting are? Or is it that the cost of capital is so high, that's really what's pushing the cost of housing up? How do these things interplay with each other, just so we could put our efforts in the right direction?
Okay, I love this question. Thank you for clarifying where you're headed with it. So the number one thing that drives housing price is demand. And if you have population growth and other kinds of demand factors that are just outpacing the ability of the market to meet that demand with supply, prices are going to rise no matter what else you're doing. Which is why having new development at any place on that income spectrum that I showed earlier is overall helpful to your affordability strategy. If you're thinking about it in terms of which parts contribute most to the cost of production, the parts that the public sector controls on the cost side are actually pretty small. The biggest variables on the cost side are going to be outside of the city's or counties or any public sector agency's control, and are going to be things like the cost of labor, the cost of materials, the cost of capital. So the pieces that you can control are really related to zoning and land supply, making sure that those areas are served, et cetera. But ultimately, if your demand is outpacing your supply, no matter what you're doing, housing prices are going to rise.
Thanks. That's really helpful, and I'm going to quote you. So thank you.
Okay.
And I guess
I get the question a lot. I get that question a lot especially about impact fees, and they are a small part of the overall cost equation.
So just to follow onto that just a little bit more, something that you mentioned, a phrase you mentioned earlier that we've used in maybe not the exact words, but similar meaning is making a meaningful difference, and balancing the difference we can make from, say, a regulatory standpoint, and I'm sure you guys hear this a lot too, and we hear it ad nauseum from the building community, is if only we had less regulatory impediments, housing would be so much more affordable. Well, the question is some of the public goods that are being generated by some of our regulations of such a magnitude that they far outweigh the financial benefits that would be accrue to those housing developments should we scale back our regulations. So I guess more at at a high level, what I really want to see come out of this collective work that we're engaged in here is some sense of what is the meaningful difference that we're going to make in any of these strategies, and is the benefit by way of attainability or affordability real and significant versus simply saving a few bucks and the overall public good, common good gets shortchanged in the process.
Yep, that's a really important set of trade-offs that you've outlined in the way that you've framed up that comment, and I completely agree that when you're trying to think about what your responsibility is as a commissioner, you have to balance out the need to provide things like infrastructure that works in a way that you can actually fund and that's consistently available. And I guess a key point to keep in mind is that so we do some work for developers, and there absolutely are times when impact fees will tip a project because they're high enough that it makes that project unfeasible. That absolutely happens sometimes. But the price of a unit is not set based on the cost of its construction. It is set based on the demand in the market and on comparables to similar units.
So you're kind of saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what government or the public sector does then. I mean, we have such a small impact then on the ultimate cost of housing.
I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. It matters quite a lot, but it doesn't matter in the direct financial way that it often gets framed. It matters for the reasons that the previous commissioner was stating, that you're sort of setting the development environment and you're creating the infrastructure and the community that allows for people to interact effectively with their environment. So the zoning and the all the placemaking work and all of that is actually really critical to public good. And can help to drive development into particular places, right? So it definitely affects development. But the cost impact on an individual unit is marginal. And sometimes that margin matters. Sometimes it matters, but it doesn't always. It depends on what's happening with all the other variables in the market.
Hearing all this, Lorelei, it really makes me think we should be focusing our efforts on what we can do to help get people into housing from their end, like grants or loans or financial instruments on their side, because we can't do anything about demand, and messing with our regulatory environment is going to be negligible in terms of the reduction of a cost on a unit, and could actually have a really big impact in terms on preservation of community values that make this place so desirable in the first place.
We could do something about demand if we polluted the river and decrease the air quality.
I remember being here in the 80s with bad air quality and a copper green river, and we did not have high demand.
Well, I wouldn't recommend that strategy.
Okay.
It might work, but the thing that I would add to the statement that you just made is that you can really make a meaningful difference in the supported environment with your dollars. Because the market is not going to provide housing for people who are at 60% or below of median family income.
So, Lorelei, I'm afraid that we're in a situation right now, at least in the urban or the metropolitan area in Missoula, where we're going to need to do supportive housing for people who are way into the middle, heading towards the top of the middle, not the top, but the top of the middle, given right now that the median household income is like $45,000 and a median house price is over $400. That we need to push. I think for us, that support, it's got to go way up your scale, because the cost of housing is so intensely valuable, so intensely high, and wages have not kept pace.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that when you've got that kind of a situation, which wouldn't surprise me at all about Missoula, you have to start thinking a lot more about access to home ownership too, because that's the way that most people are able to access any of the kind of wealth generating benefits that come from the way our system is currently set up. I actually just used this graphic for a presentation I did in the city of Hood River. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that city, but it's in the Oregon, in the gorge, and has kind of demand pressures it's much smaller than Missoula, but I think has pretty similar demand pressures. And in Hood River right now, only 20% of all of the units are affordable to people below 100% of MFI. So you've got, roughly half of the population trying to squeeze into about 20% of the available units. And that's math that we would want to do as a starting place for Missoula County, so that we can understand where that green bar really sits for you all. Okay. Other comments on this, or should we have Oscar give you an overview of our scope of work, and then we can get into our discussion questions?
Sure.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Sure. Oscar, I'll hand it to you, but I'll keep advancing your slides for you. So just tell me when you want.
So now we're going to talk about the project scope that we've identified in our proposal. And if you could advance to the next slide, Lorelei, please. So basically, our project is broken out into 4 distinct tasks, which build upon each other at every step. However, the main key takeaways here, the main products, is the development of the steering committee, which we will seek input from the commission today in a later agenda item, but also the development of the strategies for addressing affordable housing. If we could advance to the next slide, Lorelei. But overall, this project is slated to last from March to June, which is a pretty short time period in developing the strategies that we're going to deliver to you at the end of August in a presentation, as well as developing the steering committee and going going to the steering committee for input and feedback. But yeah, that is the pretty general scope of the project, which will be a pretty fast timeline for us.
Are you concerned, Oscar?
It would be definitely getting the steering committee formed as quickly as possible, and just being able to get direct feedback and focusing on what your biggest topic areas for developing this strategy would be the greatest key in ensuring that we focus our efforts where we need to.
So I guess maybe following on Juanita's question there is based on the budget that we have for this project. Do you need more time? I would hate for us to be so compressed that it's not going to be achievable within this time frame. If there's any doubt in your minds, it'd be good to figure that out now.
Hi, this is Melissa. I just wanted to let everyone know that the term of the contract actually extends through December 31st of this year. So this was the proposed scope, but if we need more time, we have it.
Okay.
Well, December 31st seems like plenty of time, and given the intensity of our market right now, I would love for us not to delay if at the end of this we could be implementing some strategies. This thing is kind of skyrocketing, and we may have lost our opportunity to catch it already, but the longer we wait, the more difficult that task is going to be.
Well, and maybe a way to split the difference would be if at any point there's some preliminary recommendations that we could move on.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Because like you were saying, we're very similar to Hood River or Bend. Like, you guys know what kind of community Missoula is. So
and I don't know those places well enough, but we're so bounded geographically that it just compounds the problem.
Yeah. I think when we put together this timeline, we were trying to balance the urgency to get to action with having a meaningful process. And as Oscar said, I think so long as we can get the steering committee formed and get these meetings scheduled and have really productive conversations, we should be able to keep this schedule. But we did just want to flag for you that if there are, if we have some challenges with getting things on the calendar or getting the committee formed, or if there are times when we need to extend a little bit, we just wanted to flag for you that this is a pretty quick decision-making timeline.
All right.
We like to make quick decisions.
Okay, good.
Arbitrary and capricious, quick decision.
There you go. Yep.
Well, we'll aim to avoid the arbitrary and capricious part of that. But
we're just completely over data driven and evidence based.
Lorelei, we didn't give you a heads up as to their interesting sense of humor. I apologize for that.
No, I like it. This is great. If I'd known, I would have started with more jokes. I would have put some funny memes in the presentation or something. You don't know the culture till you get into the conversation. So next time it'll be more fun.
But I like the idea of balancing doing a complete job with addressing this urgency that's ever increasing.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. And the steering committee conversation is on the agenda for this meeting for later in the conversation. So we'll be able to talk a little bit more and get your feedback about that composition of that group specifically. Okay, well, if you don't mind, we can move on from the scope and talk about some of the questions that we have for you all. I imagine that this is going to be kind of free flowing, and I'll do my best to take notes and keep up with you all, but we've divided the discussion questions that we've got into a couple categories, some big overall questions, and then some that I think will specifically help us to narrow our focus. So let's start with these overall questions, and we don't have to hit all of them we can kind of take them as you see them. But these are the things that were in our mind as we were trying to think about what kind of input we would need from you all to be able to get started in a useful way. So this question about what you see the county's main role to be, especially given what the city is already moving forward with and your function relative to other partners in the housing ecosystem. I'm just going to run through all these and then we can kind of open it up. How the cities and the city of Missoula can complement your efforts. I really liked the city of Missoula's vision and action categories. And if you want, if we can get there, I'll flip forward so that you can take a look at them. But I think it would be nice to have some alignment, but it might not be 100% aligned. So we'd like to have you take a look at those and see what would need to be different and why. We want to get very clear. This one is particularly important. What do you see as key outcomes of this strategy? And we actually took a crack at it and have a starting place for that. And then some bigger, more general questions around what you see as your assets and liabilities. And then what is your greatest fear? What do you think might go wrong that we can help to steer you away from? So those are all really big questions. I assume that what's going to happen is the conversation is going to flow around a little bit, but let's at least try to start with this first one. What do you see as the main role or focus of the county with supporting affordable housing development?
And Laura, you mean not at the moment, but what would we like it to be?
What would you like it to be? Yep.
Thanks.
And I also hope like staff jump in here too, so it's not just the three, because I really want to also lean on what Karen and Andrew have to say too.
Well, and part of this first question is almost shall we say what I'm hoping to get out of the strategy in terms of what are success stories out in the world of how local governments like county governments can play an effective and meaningful role in affordable housing. So for instance, as you may or may not be aware, the city recently established a trust fund, housing trust fund, and we've had some initial conversations of whether something like that would be beneficial for Missoula to create whole cloth or to contribute into a pooled fund with the city of Missoula. And I guess I don't have a good sense of going back to the spirit of making a meaningful difference. What kind of order of magnitude of a fund would we need to have, and how would it be deployed in a way that would make an appreciable and meaningful difference for attainable or affordable housing? I think that's a role that we could play, and we could bring resources perhaps to bear on that, but I don't have a great sense of how effective that would be or how it would play out in practice. Another thought, I'll just throw it in here while folks are thinking, is we can play a role in being a convener, and this is maybe a unique role that we can play on many different fronts, in that we're in a position to bring folks to the table and to begin meaningful conversations that few other entities have the ability to do. And so again, in the spirit of how have other communities wrestled with this, I think that's a role that we can play, and I would love some guidance on how that might be rolled out here in Missoula County.
So
great.
So I'm just going for it here, Lorelei. This is consensus. I'm just going for it. So in the future, I would love it if Missoula County was an actual force for helping get people into home ownership. And that could mean down payment assistance programs. It could mean new programs that are where we're jointly in on a loan with someone, or we're adding years to the size of a loan, that we are actually involved. Not that we haven't been or anything's gone wrong in the past. This is just what I'm dreaming of in the future, that we are a financial force for getting people into houses, and that we put a lot of energy toward the consumer side as opposed to the developer side.
Okay.
That's bold.
Yeah, there you go, man.
Okay. While we're just spitballing stuff here, I would love it if Missoula county government is seen as a leader in the state of Montana, and also here, even in Missoula County, when it comes to cracking the nut of affordable housing. Jumping clear down to one of your other questions here about, I don't know if it's so much a liability or well, I'm not sure if it fits, but what you'll soon learn is that folks tend to focus on the city of Missoula, and Missoula County is just kind of this background thing that people don't understand very well, and even though we're I would argue a force to be reckoned with here, folks don't have a great sense of what we are doing in a leadership role, and I think rather than just riding on the coattails of other entities, I would like us to play a prominent role in this discussion and be as creative and innovative as possible.
There you go. There's bold. We have, Lorelei, we have been the under the radar county government, the under the radar local government. So I have one other thing, and then I'll be quiet for a little bit. I also want us to put a real focus, not just on first-time home ownership, but first-generation home ownership. And this kind of rhymes with something that you said earlier in your kind of preamble, that home ownership is sort of the foundational way of generating equity across generations. And I'd like it for us to make that a focus, as one of the ways to address generational poverty is to get people into a house, first generation home ownership, not just first time home buyers. Even the wealthiest among us were once first time home buyers.
Great.
And I share my fellow commissioners' enthusiasm, but maybe I'm like I'm checking the reins a little bit, in the sense that I also want this to be sustainable, and I don't want to fully be reliant upon government, because we might have a different commission, different government. So how can this be sustainable on its own without relying too heavily on government if government isn't stable, steady? I don't know. So that's just my only hesitation.
I agree with that. I think, sorry. No, I totally agree with that, Commissioner Vera. And I think one of the, just like thinking big, and maybe this is some of the things that we're going to talk about, but for me, I think that it would be great for us as a county to be able to empower our residents with the ability to have control and authorship over their housing needs, and making it accessible. So I know we're talking about like affordable housing and lowering some of those costs, but I think that really I see our role as being able to reduce the amount of barriers it takes for folks to be able to meet their housing needs in a way that doesn't create an unnecessary burden on them meeting their other needs as well, because it makes it's very difficult to have and own a house if your other needs aren't being met as well.
Good point. Can we just kind of jump in and intermix some answers to these other things?
Absolutely. And when you
So,
absolutely can. And when you're ready, I do want to advance to have you take a look at the City of Missoula's action categories, as well as the key outcomes that we've made up, to see if those are in the right ballpark for you.
Yeah, so I've got a couple other thoughts here. So you mentioned cities in the plural. There is only one incorporated city in Missoula County. That's the City of Missoula. All of the rest of our communities are unincorporated, although we at times wish that some of them would actually take the step to be incorporated. So I guess one thing coming out of all of this would be some clarity in terms of how we can create synergy between the city's planning effort and Missoula counties, because one of the concerns I've heard from the city is, are we just being duplicative of what the city of Missoula has done already? And my response to that is that even though the city of Missoula is in Missoula County, without a doubt, Missoula County is much more expansive than that. So we want to be attentive to the needs of some of the unique needs of housing in our rural communities, either bedroom communities of Missoula or more far-flung locations such as Sealy Lake or Condon, et cetera. So I think having a strong emphasis of how our strategy can be not only inclusive of what is happening in the urbanizing area, but also in these more distant communities, rural communities in Missoula County is important.
Yep.
So on the bullet about what do you see as key outcomes of this strategy, I'd really like it if we ended up with a list of things we should do.
Here's what we started. We made something up to see if we were anywhere near the right ballpark. And one of them is exactly what you just said, prioritized action steps for staff implementation. But what do you all see as the key outcomes from this project?
So as those action steps, I really hope that they're not study more, because that could be an action step too, right? Yep. So, but actually, like, do these things that could have an effect. And I get that because this is market driven, it's way larger than all of us, and our effects could be powerful, but will always still be limited. But we really do need to do something, and study more wouldn't be a good wouldn't be a satisfying answer. But actually, do these three things would be really good.
Okay.
Jordan, how's this make you feel?
This is great. I feel like, I feel like we're really off to the races here, and a lot of great input.
Hey, Jordan, sorry, just for my sake, can you remind me how much time we have on the agenda for this part so that I make sure that we get to the most important questions before we hand it back to you?
So I think, let me take a look at the agenda here. So, we probably have about 4 more minutes. Just perfectly on track, but we had about 30 minutes of wiggle room. So, yeah, if you need 10 minutes or whatever, 15 minutes, I think that's totally fine.
No, thank you for that reminder.
Just want to throw one other thing out. As you guys are doing your work and looking at what's happening in other places, and please don't throw anything out. And I guess what I'm getting that is don't say, imagine that, they're too small to do this, so we won't even include that. Or they just don't have the money for that, or they don't have the expertise for that. Like, dream big, and if you stumble into things that could really help, we can figure out how to get there.
Someone else can pull back on the reins, but go for it.
Okay, we'll gallop ahead.
We should decide if, we couldn't possibly do that. I don't want you guys to make that decision for us.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. I do think it would be very helpful to talk about this question number 4 at least a little bit. There are almost certainly populations of people within the county that are more impacted by the housing market and lack of access to it than other populations, and we want to make sure that we are centering their needs as we're doing this work. Can you help us think about how we should do that and who those groups are, and what is your starting place understanding of disproportionate impacts?
And we do seem to be focusing a whole bunch right now on home ownership, but there's a whole other side of this for people who rent, and there are people who face obstacles getting into rentals that are really high, that it shouldn't be that way. There are people out there with housing vouchers that can't find housing. Property management companies don't want to accept them, and figuring out how we deal with some of that would really be helpful. People who have issues in their past, maybe they were incarcerated or in some treatment programs or something for a long time, and now they're out and they have money and they can't get into rentals. Figuring out how we get past those obstacles and make sure that everyone is adequately housed is really important. I don't have good ideas on that.
Yeah, That's all excellent. And I'll just add to that we also have folks who are completely unhoused. And so at that end of the spectrum, we're nowhere close to talking about home ownership. We're just trying to get folks out of the floodplain who are camped out in the middle of winter into some more stable trajectory housing wise. So I think at some level, that's got to be in the mix.
Absolutely.
I think the question number 4, in terms of ensuring vulnerable populations, is really connected to the first point there. I tend to think in terms of what are some of the issues that are connected, that are exacerbating some of our challenges. And so for me, it's important to think about if we are looking to increase access to housing and make housing more accessible to folks. Again, I think that it's important to be able to create opportunities for folks to be able to pay on that. So it certainly is a workforce contributor to that. If in terms of land and development, in terms of supply and demand, it doesn't really do us much good to build more houses if folks don't make enough money to be able to put themselves in those houses. And I use, just echoing Commissioner Slotlick's words, I use housing as a broad term that could be, renting or something like that as well. And so I think it really does take having a sort of intersectional approach of being able to really deconstruct some of the root causes in order to move us forward.
Yep. Okay.
This is Andrew. To build on that, I think location is part of the equation here with vulnerable populations. As we talk about Missoula County, it takes about 2 hours to drive across our county from south to north. And vulnerable populations are less resilient in terms of their ability to manage other, something like a car breaking down. And if we're providing for affordable housing or subsidized housing that's 30 minutes from town or an hour to town, we're making these vulnerable populations less resilient to other impacts in their life, farther from services, farther from other support programs they need. So if they do, their 1976 Cordoba breaks down that they bought for $500, then they're completely cut off from all other aspects of their life. So I think location is important part of this. How do we ensure vulnerable populations can address these housing costs?
Yep, Andrew, are you trying to induce motion sickness with us?
Yes.
Is this not fun? I'm having a great time.
It looks like you're at a rave with like fancy lights going on in the background.
Actually, Andrew is in his 1976 Cordoba right now.
All right, I'll turn my camera off.
On the flip side to what Andrew brings up is also that not everyone, housing has long been a topic of conversation in the greater Missoula urban area, and less of a conversation in outlying areas where we know people need and want to be able to age in place. There are people who are working in schools or other jobs out in rural communities, and they need to have places to live too. And when they're faced with housing prices that are influenced by those being destination locations like Sealy Lake, where people are coming in for their vacations, and the second home market's pretty hot, then that's a problem for them as well.
Here's something else I'll throw out here. I don't know, again, I've lost track of how well any of these things fit into specific categories, but we had a conversation this morning about the need in one of our adjoining communities to really have some serious infrastructure investments, but how do you do so in a way that does not promote gentrification and price escalation in housing as a result of that? So to the extent that we can develop an element of our strategy that gets at that would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay, big questions. I know that we've already gone over the 4 minutes and are into the grace period that we have here for this discussion, but maybe if we could just pass the baton to each of the commissioners and have you give 30 seconds of something you're worried about and any parting advice and words that you might have for us as we launch into this work. And I can't see you all, so you're just going to have to just jump in and do it.
I can share my concerns first, that what we're going to come up with at the end of this will not be strong enough and not be timely enough. Okay. I really feel like we're going to have to start thinking of new ways to address this because it's such an intense problem. We may really need to shake up our whole paradigm on what homeownership means and how a person gets there. And there you go. I'm concerned that we're going to come up with too little, too late.
Yeah, I think the opportunity is to come up with something that is bold, creative, and innovative. And my worry would be that we do end up at the end of the day with a plan that is, I think, as Josh suggested earlier, as a concern, is just a plan to do more planning, or is not concrete enough that it's really actionable. And I think the public is wanting, I'm guessing that the public is wanting that out of this, is not just something that kind of melts into the background of all of the other myriad planning efforts that have occurred in Missoula County, but something that we can jump on and make a difference with.
And this is Juanita. Yep, I can't disagree. But I know we have a really talented group of folks gathered, and yeah, we're ready to make something happen. So yes, we want to be actionable. We want Jordan to be successful.
All right. That's great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I should have stopped sharing my screen a while ago. Then I could have seen you. This would have been so much easier.